privilege to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, our brother Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine. I don't know if any of you all have the opportunity to read that magazine. I read the last issue from cover to cover, could hardly put it down. And it's a bastion of good writing and good history. If you are looking for something where the writers are very thoughtful and have studied through and have a broad scope of history and what's happening and putting it all together, Liberty Magazine is it. And I think it holds a unique place in our church outreach to reach a specific group. And Lincoln Steed has been editor of this magazine for many years. How many? 22 years. So it's the voice of religious liberty that has come to be here today in the topic, religious liberty and the three angels' messages. Please welcome Lincoln Steed. Thank you.
Well, I have good news and bad news, depends who you are, but for me, good news. I'm in the process of retiring. 22 years is going to be it for me. But Liberty Magazine goes back to 1906, and then with a short break before that with the Sentinel, back to A.T. Jones's era in the 1880s. About 10 years ago, when I was thinking not so much what to do with excess funds for Liberty Magazine, which we've never had, but we used to have some significant resources because, you know, praise the Lord, our religious liberty work is one of the best funded aspects of at least publishing outreach. I don't know if you are up on any of the numbers of our periodicals, and remember Ellen White over and over again said that our publishing work was to disseminate material like the leaves of autumn, like bands of light around the world, you know, incredible imagery. And she said further, which I take very much to heart, that our publishing work is the last to close. And we've had signs of the times. Of course, we started with the Advent Herald and the Review and Herald, but Signs of the Times has been what most of our members think of as our main outreach avenue. And I can remember when I went to Pacific Press in 1985, I had several jobs, but ended up being book editor. But when I first went there, they had just combined These Times and Signs of the Times, and at that point they'd both declined to about 500,000 circulation. When they combined them, it was one magazine of 500,000. But that was then. Today, Signs is down around 50,000. Liberty Magazine is about 100, it depends. It's dropped a bit with the closure of the Review, but it's somewhere between 150 and about 170,000 every issue, which by default makes it our largest outreach journal, largest distribution. And it's targeted directly to thought leaders. And my wife even has called me on it. She says, "We're thought leaders." You know, that's demeaning. But, you know, what by that we mean community leaders, legislators, governors, mayors, politicians of all types, state and federal, lawyers, many professionals, librarians, you know, you go on and on. But people in the community that set the tone. We want them to know what we believe for these times in relation to church-state issues. But, you know, I tried to get everything else in there. When I thought back about those monies and what to do with them about 10 years ago, something came to mind, and I don't know how many of you have ever seen the White Estate have a rather thick, well, it's bound, but not a professionally printed collection of Ellen White comments on church-state relations. It's typewriter style, and they're all bundled together and bound. And I thought that this needed to be disseminated more widely. So with Liberty monies, we reformatted it and reprinted it with a nicer cover. Those of you that like Harry Anderson would recognize that. We clipped the picture to cut off the 50s style cars, and it's still a relevant picture. Within that, there's something I want to start off by reading, but first of all, I want to read what I hadn't myself read for over a decade. When we pulled this together, I put a little statement on the back, and I think it sets the tone for what I need to share with you this afternoon. I wrote there that religious liberty has always been an integral part of the history, theology, and prophetic awareness of Seventh-day Adventists. cast out of their former churches, and then harassed by blue laws, Adventists saw themselves in the continuum of the faithful through the ages, quote, contending for the faith. Ellen G. White wrote much on religious liberty and always gave it the big picture treatment. I hope you see the present truth, in quotes, for our time in this collection from her pen. There are many wonderful quotes, and I could just recommend that you either contact our Religious Liberty Department, and they have some of these left, and they'll send you one. If not, contact the White Estate, and I think they charge $5 for it. Further over in this, I've got it marked here, on page 14, because this greatly compacted it when we put it in smaller type size. There's a few things that Ellen White wrote roughly around the time of 1888 and the great crisis of conscience and the test of prophetic fulfillment that the possible Sunday law brought to our people. This is what she wrote. What is the Sentinel for? And the Sentinel was the precursor to Liberty magazine. What is it for? But to be the voice of the watchman on the walls of Zion, to sound the danger signal. We are not to cringe or beg pardon of the world for telling the truth. We should scorn concealment. Unfurl your colours. Now, we're guilty of many things. And, thankfully the Lord will cover much of that if we're of a contrite heart and dedicated to Him. But, we are guilty as a church and going under deep cover. I don't know why it comes upon us. I remember, well, it'll have to go on the record, but I remember with some embarrassment a few years ago, two of us from the Religious Liberty Department were showing the religion minister from Mexico through the General Conference building. We ended up in the chief office. This was before the present administration, so it's not a critique in that regard. And we sat there to hear how we would officially present ourselves to this representative of a major government. And I remember looking at the other individual, and we both rolled our eyes as we heard said to this representative, Seventh-day Adventists are just like other Christians. If that's the case, we shouldn't be here. Anyhow, Ellen White said, in your opinions and faith, there must not be the least appearance of wavering. The world has a right to know what to expect of us, and will look upon us as dishonest, as hiding our real sentiments and principles out of policy, if we carry even the semblance of being uncommitted till the popular voices pointed out the safe way. The Comforter, the Holy Spirit, which Christ said He would send into the world, was to bear an unwavering testimony. Many of these rulers are unaware of Adventists, that's to be sure. And we need to get not just Liberty magazine, but we need to get whatever we can get to them, if not face-to-face meetings. And let me tell you, it's not as hard as you might think to go face-to-face with many of our government leaders. For example, if you travel to Washington and go through the metal detector into the office buildings of the Senate or the congressional offices, I can guarantee you will pass familiar faces in the hallway. You will. I remember on one occasion in one of the elevators there, Senator Lieberman, he's retired now, but he was there, and I showed him the magazine and we talked a bit. Last thing he said to me, we believe in what you're doing. I love Liberty magazine, I read it. I remember another time I wanted to get through to General Barry McCaffrey, who you still see on TV now and then as an expert, someone criticising what's happening often. But, he's a decorated general, third in command rather, in Desert Storm. I met with him. First thing he told me when I introduced myself as a Seventh-day Adventist, he said, I owe my life to a Seventh-day Adventist corpsman in Vietnam. And then after twice the time allotted officially, as he was being dragged down the hall by an assistant, he called out to me 3 times. He said, we believe in what you're doing. We believe in what you're doing. It's our privilege, not only our responsibility, to contact these people And with Liberty Magazine, we've had that advantage. But it's more than that. It's so tied up with our history. Another part of our history that goes along with the same time frame of 1888 is a rethink, not just a rejection on a certain level, because I don't believe Jones and Wagner were rejected. It was not embraced as it should have been. But at that same time, they were rethinking how we project ourselves to the world. And Ellen White said, "In the night season, I was present in several councils. And there I heard words repeated by influential men to the effect that if the American Sentinel would drop the word Seventh-day Adventist from its columns and would say nothing about the Sabbath, the great men of the world would patronize it and it would become popular and do a larger work." This looked very pleasing. And I can tell you, I've been in the same meetings. The tendency is not gone. There are some who are embarrassed by what we have. They want to go deep cover, just talk legalese, talk legal principles, when at the end of the day, that's fine, and if it leads toward the truth, but we've got to strike home with what we believe. And she said, the men could not see why we could not affiliate with unbelievers and non-professors to make the American Sentinel a great success. I saw their countenances brighten, and they began to work on a policy plan to make the Sentinel a popular success. This is the first in a succession of wrong steps, she said. The principles which have been advocated, and I'm reading this now for this reason, the principles which have been advocated in the American Sentinel are the very sum and substance of the advocacy of the Sabbath. And when men begin to talk of changing these principles, they are doing a work which does not belong to them to do. Like Uzzah, they are attempting to steady the ark which belongs to God and is under his special supervision. Said my guide to those in these councils, who of the men among you have felt the burden of the cause from the first and have accepted responsibilities under trying circumstances? Who has carried the burden of the work during the years of its existence? Who has practiced self-denial and self-sacrifice? The Lord made a place for his staunch servants whose voices have been heard in warning. He carried forward his work before any of you put your hands to it. And that's where we are. We follow on from the others. And I've got to tell you, after 22 years of editing Liberty Magazine, in my mind, it's still Roland Hegsted's magazine. And I'm sure he felt similarly for those that went before him. And of course, you can carry it back to A.T. Jones. You can carry it back, as we did a few years ago, remembering the Reformation, to the Reformers. You can carry it back to the very first prophetic voices that stirred those that were living on from Eden. And he says, Ellen White wrote here, in the American Sentinel, and again, this is why I'm sharing it, in the American Sentinel has been published the truth for this time. Take heed what you do, except the Lord build the house. They labor in vain that build it. You know, the story of 1888 is central to our religious liberty work, and of course, very important to this group to review and to analyse. But it wouldn't have happened, none of it would have happened, but for changes in this country, an upwelling of an always resident wish by Christians in this country to take control of the country, fulfill its manifest destiny. You know, there's a tangled sort of an understanding by many Christians in America that this is a Christian nation, not true in the structural sense. There's a tangled sense that Adventists, I think, understand more clearly than most about God's leading in this nation. Yes, he's led. We see signs of his leading. But no country, not even God's special people in the promised land, are assured of God's leading if they go otherwise than the way he calls them. So this is not blessed regardless of what it does. If it lives in a godly manner, this country will be blessed. But it's not sort of, you know, God's a new Israel planted here to do whatever they decide, even if it's in contrary to God's will. But so there was an upwelling of this in 1888, and the result was the Blair Sunday Bill. And, you know, I can presume that you're more informed than most, but I can tell you, most Adventists have never actually read the bill. And many of them, when they think of Sunday laws, you know, they think of blue laws, which still exist in about 20 of the states. They're just not applied. In fact, I think it's the Achilles heel of the Western legal system. You know, the state and federal legislators and even some of the local councils, they're meeting all the time and passing laws, and they go into the books, and you go into a law library and there's a wall of this stuff. And after a while, it's common law. It doesn't go away, it sets precedent and it establishes norms. So even though you and I are not criticised or penalised anymore for breaking the Sunday blue laws, they exist, they can be brought forward anytime. Not too long ago, I was in Bismarck, North Dakota, for some meetings, and on the Sunday before my plane left, I wanted to go to Walmart, and Walmart's open on any holiday, right? So I go to Walmart, big sign on the door, blue law, we are not open on Sundays, always closed. So it's invoked there. The blue laws exist. But let me just read you the first long paragraph of the Blair Sunday Bill, so you'll see the nature of it. And I think after reading this, you'll see that, our scandalised reaction to what was going on in Afghanistan with the Taliban before the invasion after 9/11 is probably a little misplaced, because it's possible anywhere. This is what it said. It's called the Sunday Rest Bill. It's a bill to secure to the people the enjoyment of the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day, by the way, which is a rather sinister approach to approve of it. You know, rather than argue from the Bible whether it's the seventh day or the sixth day, the Lord's Day. Anyhow, on the Lord's Day, as a day of rest and to promote its observance as a day of religious worship, be it enacted by the Senate of the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that no person or corporation or the agent, servant or employee of any person or corporation shall perform or authorize to be performed any secular work, labour or business to the disturbance of others, works of necessity, mercy and humanity accepted, nor shall any person engage in any play, game or amusement or recreation. Remember, Ellen White says you can go for a walk in the woods on Sunday when the laws come. It would have been illegal if the neighbours objected to you going for a nice Sunday walk. Or any recreation to the disturbance of others on the first day of the week, commonly known as the Lord's Day, or during any part thereof, in any territory, district, vessel, or place subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of the United States, nor shall it be lawful for any person or corporation to receive pay for labour or services performed or rendered in violation of this section. That's a Sunday law. All it's missing is the extreme penalty, but there would be a penalty to that. Fines, and if you don't pay us fine, you're imprisoned. I mean, that's how it is now. You get a speeding ticket. You can end up in jail for the most minor offence if you refuse to pay it. And it's worth remembering that when there were only about 10,000, 15,000 Seventh-day Adventists, as many as 900 of them were often severely fined and a number of them imprisoned and put on the chain gangs for breaking the Sunday blue laws. That's a very high percentage of the early group. And I'll admit, because it's a fact of history, that a few of them provoked those laws. They very publicly mowed their lawn or did something that they knew would offend the neighbour. But still, they were improper laws that still exist. A.T. Jones, of course, was front and centre in opposing these laws, which were backed by just about every religious entity in the United States. Curiously enough, the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, it still exists and many Adventists belong to it, but it's a weakened, sort of antiquated organisation now. But back in those days, it was one of the major public service organisations that existed. And curiously, the WCTU were front and centre pushing for this at the same time that Ellen White was speaking at their meetings, which shows that on certain common interests we can work with those that in other areas might be opposing us. She was speaking at their temperance meetings. But yeah, the posing, of course, with A.T. Jones, this incipient Sunday law. It seemed unstoppable, but A.T. Jones and a few others, we've got to give credit. There was not just the Adventists against it. There were some free thinkers, some secularists, but really not too many religionists that were opposing it. And it was opposed, of course, on constitutional grounds primarily. But A.T. Jones, if you read his testimony, and he exaggerates a bit because not all of what he prints as what he said was given verbally, but all of it was put into the public record. You must understand there's a difference between that, even now. When they have these hearings, they might go for hours, but someone may get up and speak for 5 minutes, and then they will, often they say, I will put this in for the public record, and they might put 100 pages in. But we are well on record as opposing it, and A.T. Jones and Ellen White were quite convinced that this was essentially unstoppable. They were absolutely convinced this was a prophetic fulfillment, and at the same time they recognized, as you could identify at almost any time in the history of God's church, they identified the church was not ready. That's what compelled or impelled A.T. Jones to be so powerful in preaching for righteousness on righteousness by faith. He wanted to stir the faithful to be spiritually ready for this great crisis. I asked Raymond a few days ago, because I'm in a little bit of a disturbance with my papers because I had to drag everything back from the office, and I couldn't find some duplicated pages that I'd taken from one of A.T. Jones's sermons, but I've used it many, many times. It was a couple of years after 1888, and he was preaching on this topic, and he put what was usually theologically expressed in the most practical terms. He said, when this law, either in a Sunday law or more severe and generalized laws of religious and compulsion, which are unconstitutional, he said that, but when these laws come, and he says the full force of law is against you, and they're going to take away your property, they'll take away your means of employment, they will imprison not just you, but your family, they will come at you from every angle. He says, when that happens, he says, nobody can stand. Everybody has their price, and eventually, most times, and countries recognize this, under torture, most everybody will break. And he said, but if you have died to this world, if you've so committed yourself to Christ and the things of heaven, and forsaken all these, what's the word he used? It's not frippery, but he uses a word of just the inconsequential things of this world. If you've died to that, if you've put that side those things aside, he says you are safe. Nobody can touch you. And I believe today it's the same thing. Where we are as Seventh-Evers, I don't know about you, but I have my retirement, I have my little savings. It's going to be hard if someone comes at all of that. But if I recognize, as the old hymns, and we talk about singing hymns, says, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. I'm a poor wayfaring stranger. That's a way of thinking that is quite alien to today. And it was very alien, curiously, in 1888, and they were only a few decades past, the great disappointment and the time of standing on the, Ascension Rock, expecting to go. By the way, a few years ago, I had an object, or was part of an object lesson in how easily those expecting the return of Christ can be blamed for all the troubles. I had traveled to Ambon, Indonesia, with Dr. John Gratz, who was then head of the Religious Liberty Department at the GC, and we'd both decided to go on the trip because, as we often did, we'd gone together down to a hearing in Washington. It was on Vietnam, and Vietnam was interesting to me because when I was growing up, the Vietnam War was raging, and my grades were good and my number was good, and I never went, but I thought a lot about the Vietnam War, so I wanted to see how Vietnam, or hear how Vietnam was faring, and religious liberty in particular. So we went down, and to our astonishment, after maybe 5 minutes discussing Vietnam, they got on to then, this was a few years ago, a religious conflict that was raging in Indonesia. Indonesia, Australians know, but the rest of the world's not quite as aware, is the largest Muslim country in the world, 200 million people in Indonesia, and 95% of them Muslim. And Australia has lived in not so much fear, but readiness of a full-scale war with that country many times. And we heard to our surprise that this overwhelmingly Muslim country, and this it started just a little before 9/11, that this overwhelmingly Muslim country actually had some pockets of Christianity, and in the province of Maluku, far to the east, and the capital city of Ambon, by the way, it's near where the Battle of Coral Sea was fought, beautiful tropical paradise, and Ambon's a city of about 300,000 people. In that area, it was mostly Christian. And so we heard evidence that Al-Qaeda decided to foment unrest there, as they had been doing in many countries of the world. And it was successful because on a pretext, a fight between a taxi driver and his fare, violence broke out. And almost instantly, gangs of Christians and Muslims formed up in the middle of the city with knives, machetes, guns, and any weapon they can get hold of. And we ended up going there, so I'm not just telling you this from the hearings. And thousands of people in the middle of town, Muslims and Christians, and the Christians were crying out, "Everybody ought to know who Jesus is." And the Muslims were yelling, "Allah Akbar," and they clashed, and many people died, and the fighting had continued until we visited, way after the hearings that we attended. Thousands of people were killed. At first, the Christian police gave their weapons to the Christians, then the national military were called in, and they were overwhelmingly Muslim, and they gave their weapons to the Muslims. So it was a full-scale civil war. We decided to go check on it, and it was under martial law at the time, and tourists and journalists were not allowed, but somehow we were allowed in. They promised us a police escort or a military escort. We never had it, and I never felt threatened, to be honest. But I've never seen such desperate destruction. Maybe a third to a half of every structure destroyed and burned. And that was villages out on the way to the city. In the city itself, office buildings burned and abandoned. The government assembly room burned and abandoned. The university that had tens of thousands of students burned and abandoned. It was destruction on every hand. And we did the rounds while we were there, met with the mayor. That was interesting. He met us under a picture of the mosque in Mecca, and as we came in the door, he stepped forward. It was in his home, actually. And the leader of the Muslim community came forward, and the first words the mayor said, he said, "This is a wonderful meeting." He says, "You're the first outsiders and the first Christians to come here." He says, "If you'd come during the middle of the violence, you'd have been killed on the spot." It wasn't frightening, but it was a grim reminder of where we were at. That same day, we journeyed on through a rather scary Muslim community where one of the school teachers with us was telling me, he says, "I see the jihadis, they're here." I said, "How do you know?" He says, "I remember them." And we went to a visit with the Minister of Religion, a very urbane, educated fellow with a doctorate, Muslim. But he spoke very nicely with us, invoked the Bible and Jesus' principles of love and concern for our fellows. And it was a nice meeting. Even amazing because his wife, a medical doctor, served us drinks and socialized with us. And in Muslim countries, that does not happen. The women usually are kept behind a door. You never see them. It's just a shame to the woman and to the community if they are flaunted in front of strangers. So after a while, when we were friendly and we were talking about stuff, the minister leaned to us and he said, "I need your help for the most pressing and urgent problem facing our community." And remember what I've told you. A good percentage of every structure burned and abandoned. People murdered right, left, and center. Even when we went there, they still would not take the boat across the bay anymore because Muslim chase boats were catching people, killing them. And in a country where they eat a lot of fish, people wouldn't eat the fish because they were feasting on human bodies. The most pressing problem. Then he started to tell us of something that luckily I knew about because I'd read the newspapers in Jakarta, that we were there in February of the year, and early the year before, a Christian missionary or a leader, I'm not sure he was an outsider, but a local, but a Christian leader had arisen preaching that the Lord Jesus Christ was to return in November of that same year. And Dr. Mara Sabasi, the religion minister, he said, many people believed. He said they sold their property, they gave it away, they just disengaged totally, and they went with him to an outer island to wait for the return of Jesus. And he said he hasn't come. And he said now they want their property back. He said this is the most dangerous thing that we're facing. I mean, on the face of it, it's ridiculous. But with that social trauma and murder and mayhem on every hand, he was ready to blame it all on these, in this case, because it's a false hope, these foolish people. And I said to him, you'd be better up reinstating the property to Muslims and Christians disadvantaged by this violence than reinstating what people have lost by their foolishness. And, he took that. But it was a message to me, which I think we're about to live through here, of how easily you can be blamed. Because I must tell you that with Liberty Magazine and our historic stance of separation of church and state, that is not the view held by Christians and most right-wing politicians in this country. I've been to meetings and they'll spit it out. Separation of church and state. I remember Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade, been dead a few years, but one of his last appearances, he's got oxygen up his nose with a tank next to him, and he looked at the camera and he says, the separation of church and state is a satanic principle. And one of the things that's made it easier for me to sign on the dotted line and go into retirement is even the reaction from some Adventists. I spoke to an Adventist the other day. He called me up. First, he was quite friendly. I've gotten used to, not in the long term, Adventists are very supportive, but the last 2 years, I've had Adventists call up and berate me for even mildly criticizing the administration. God's man, whether he is or not, that's a hard judgment to make. But as I wrote to somebody who was pushing on that, I said, you need to get over this dear leader complex. We only have one leader, that's Jesus Christ, the Lord Jesus Christ. We're heavenly citizens. We're not mixed up in these power struggles here. Many Adventists are. And this Adventist called me up and he had a question on one article, and at first I thought he was against this article because it was an opinion piece from an Adventist that was trying to invoke principles in the Old Testament for self-defense. As a balance, we'd put it in because people had criticized us having an article that spoke of taking away weapons. I mean, not so much taking away, but, it was anti-weapons. And I thought that he was against that. And I said, I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in weapons. Jesus said, you take up the sword, you die by the sword. And he says, oh no, he says, I think the state has a responsibility by law to force you to godliness, to force you to obey God's word. And we went on, and in the end I had to say, thank you, bye. There was no end to it, just digging in. And remember what Ellen White says, it is many of those among us that will be our worst enemies. They will be forcing the issue. And I don't know how it came about, but a good percentage of Anglo members in North America are hard, right-wing, arm of the law, forced obedience, people who would have signed on the bottom line for a national Sunday law and will when it comes. This is a dangerous time. When I was in Australia, a few years ago now, but I was almost fresh out of Andrews University. I graduated from college at Columbia Uni College, and then I went to Andrews for a master's, and I intended to go back to Australia. I'd spoken to the president, but I was waiting for the call, so I walked in the door of the review and worked there for a few months, but then I went straight to Australia. It was in the mid-70s, and Australia was being absolutely turned upside down by Desmond Ford and his ancillary Brinsmead and even a foreign agent, Jeffrey Paxton. Interesting time. I could speak for hours about that. And it nearly brought the church there to its knees. But part of the reason it did was that the leadership backed Ford. They didn't seem to understand the poison chalice that they were passing around. And I had many jobs, but I ended up being the assistant on the division paper and writing most of the editorials and putting it together. I'd get the news. It goes way back. I feel like ancient on printing. It was movable type even back then. I had to count the characters on the lines, and I would do the page where it was paper that you'd scratch off. You'd put ink where the type was supposed to be and scratch off the end. You'd put a little plastic sheet down where the picture was. I had to size them and so on. I did the whole magazine from beginning to end. And I saw firsthand the way we were reacting, because they never would tell the members what was really going on. Open warfare, where it's hard to know the percentage, but hundreds in the long term Adventist pastors left, but worse, many of them were getting up on the pulpit. I remember one threw his Ellen White books in a garbage bin on the stage. Incredible time. One pastor, even when I went to his church, the elder requested me to come, but I went 3 times. He never was there. But finally, the last time, he comes slinking in the back door when I was getting ready for the meeting, and no introduction. He says, I don't believe in the sanctuary. I don't believe in the Sabbath. I don't believe in Ellen White. He says, but I think I should be allowed to be a pastor as long as I keep quiet about it. And I said, you're barely a Christian. To be true to your principles, you should leave. But he didn't. So as I was doing the division paper, I had to process these statements that came from the GC or the division, sort of shadowboxing an issue that the members were never told about. And in the end, I thought, I'm going to put something in. I expected to get into trouble about it. I wrote a little one-page thing about how there was the challenge on the sanctuary. This was one of our foundational principles. And while there were issues to be discussed, we never could back on this because it's so integral to our doctrinal understanding that was given to us and clarified to us by a prophet. And then with that, I included a statement that you probably know. I mean, there's been many readings of Ellen White already in the last couple of days, and to some degree we preach to ourselves. But I want to share this with you because I discovered at that time, not an obscure section, but something that was very relevant from Testimonies Volume 5. Ellen White wrote under the title of The Testimony Slighted in 1882, just before, obviously, 1888, something about the state of the church then. Now, her husband had just died, which made her personally uneasy. Fights were breaking out among the members for leadership and doctrinal reasons. And so she wrote this testimony to the church at Battle Creek, which was really the main body of believers. And she said this. I'm not going to read all of it, but I'll read several paragraphs. She says, "The patience of God has an object, but you are defeating it. He is allowing a state of things to come that you would fain see counteracted by and by, but it will be too late. God commanded Elijah to anoint the cruel and deceitful Hazael, king over Syria, that he might be a scourge to idolatrous Israel. Who knows whether God will not give you up to the deceptions you love? Who knows but that the preachers who are faithful, firm, and true may be the last who shall offer the gospel of peace to our unthankful churches? It may be that the destroyers are already training under the hand of Satan and only wait the departure of a few more standard bearers to take their places, and with the voice of the false prophet cry, 'Peace, peace,' when the Lord has not spoken peace. I seldom weep, but now I find my eyes blinded with tears. They are falling upon my paper as I write. It may be that ere long all prophesyings among us will be at an end, and the voice which has stirred the people may no longer disturb their carnal slumbers. Our only safety," she continued one paragraph later, "is to stand as God's peculiar people. We must not yield 1 inch to the customs and fashions of this degenerate age, but stand in moral independence, making no compromise with its corruptions and idolatrous practices. It will require courage and independence to rise above the religious standard of the Christian world. They do not follow the Saviour's example of self-denial. They make no sacrifice. They are constantly seeking to evade the cross, which Christ declares to be the token of discipleship. And then she says, if all of those who come together for meetings of edification and prayer could be regarded as true worshippers, then we might hope, though much would still remain to be done for us. But it is vain to deceive ourselves. Things are far from being what the appearance would indicate. From a distant view, much may appear beautiful, which upon close examination will be found full of deformities. The prevailing spirit of our time is that of infidelity and apostasy, a spirit of pretended illumination because of a knowledge of the truth, but in reality of the blindest presumption. There is a spirit of opposition to the plain word of God and to the testimony of his Spirit. There is a spirit of idolatrous exaltation of mere human reason above the revealed wisdom of God. And she says, if all that appears to be divine life was such in reality, if all who profess to present the truth to the world were preaching for the truth and not against it, and if they were men of God guided by his Spirit, then might we see something cheering amid the prevailing moral darkness. But the spirit of Antichrist is prevailing to such an extent as never before. And I'm skipping over because I can see everyone discovers it's going to consume, time is going to consume it. And she says, the time is not far distant. And this is a quote that religious liberty people use a lot. The time is not far distant. I think she was given intimations of 1888, but of course it relates to us now. The time is not far distant when the test will come to every soul. The mark of the beast will be urged upon us. Those who have step by step yielded to worldly demands and conformed to worldly customs will not find it a hard matter to yield to the powers that be, rather than subject themselves to derision. Very good choice of words. Derision is the first thing. You just sort of mocked, laughed at. Derision, insult, gets a little more nasty, threatened imprisonment, and death. The contest between the commandments of God and the commandments of men. The contest is between. In this time, the gold will be separated from the dross in the church. True godliness will be clearly distinguished from the appearance and tinsel of it. Many a star that we have admired for its brilliancy will then go out in darkness. Chaff like a cloud will be borne away on the wind, even from the places where we only see floors of rich wheat. All who assume the ornaments of the sanctuary but are not clothed with Christ's righteousness will appear in the shame of their own nakedness. You know, she was using the term well before 1888. I was listening before to, I think it was the previous lecture, and the idea was given that what if half Adventists were not ready? But you know, that's overconfident, I think. What did Ellen White say in her day? Not 1 in 20. And they were the good old days. I don't want to bring up the discussion, but I've lived through heavy discussions on the 144,000. You know, if it were to be, or is to be, 144,000 alive after troubles such as never been seen, and as Jesus said, unless those days be shortened, no flesh will survive. If 144,000 living righteous can be found, praise God. You know, how many during the flood? 1 in 20, I think that'd be great. I can remember a few years ago, our membership is going up quickly. And I did some division, and it came out to 150,000 at that point. You know, we're way beyond that now. But again, you know, we have to think clearly about this. There's signs as you travel the world, particularly the non-Western world, particularly. You see God's Spirit moving. People are coming in droves. God will have to decide, but it's very obvious that in many places we baptize people willy-nilly, you know, on a simple profession, and they've not even, I've met them, they've never heard the name of Ellen White, for example, or the message that she gives to our church. You know, what security is that in a time of crisis that they'll stay the course? These are difficult times, and numbers are not to be relied upon. Remember the plagues that came on Israel because David thought to number Israel. One of the worst things to do. And I grew up, in the church, and I've been to a few GCs, and whether we'll have another one, I'm not sure. You know, they shut it down so easy. But there was always a chart of the world, the countries, entered and unentered, as though when we check off the countries, the Lord will come. That's missing. Probably your neighbour hasn't heard. There's not going to be any magical moment when everybody knows. Even as we sit here and I stand here, dozens of people have died without a knowledge. That should be our compulsion, to lighten the earth with the knowledge of Christ and his soon coming. But in spite of Ellen White's description, I'm reminded as I read the Bible, it's been worse. I've taken a sermon in the past from 2 Kings chapter 22, where it talks there about Josiah, little King Josiah. Remember, he was put in office as 8 years old, and when he was come of age, the high priest Hilkiah says, I found the book of the law. In other words, I found the Bible. It's hidden away and brought it forth. It was sort of a rare thing, as the Bible says, speaking elsewhere in the time of Judges. The word of the law was rare in those days. And they read it to the king, and he was disturbed and rent his clothes. And then it's very interesting as he worked with the prophetess, which is interesting, Huldah. It's interesting to read there, because I don't want to read the whole thing. I don't want to give the singular sermon on this. But it's interesting to read what the king did with the word of the Lord at hand and a sense of reform. It says the king commanded, I will read parts of these verses from verse 4 of chapter 23. It says, the king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the keepers of the threshold to bring out of the temple all the vessels made for Baal. They're in the temple. The nearest I can come to that, and in Australia I preached a sermon on it, I've had a few in this country, and big debates with Adventist servicemen. We don't have it here. The flag planted up behind, to me that's Baal in the sanctuary, right? And it says they brought out of the temple, the vessels of Baal out of the temple, the Asherah and all the host of heaven, and he burned them outside Jerusalem, and he deposed the idolatrous priests whom the kings of Judah had ordained to burn incense in the high places, incense to Baal, to the sun, and to the moon, and to the constellation, and all the host of the heavens. And he brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord to the brook Kidron, and burned it there, and beat it to dust, and put it on the graves of the common people. I don't know why that, because it was shaming them, because maybe they were worshippers of Baal. And he broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes. This is in Israel, among God's people, which were in the house of the Lord, where the women wove hangings for the Asherah. And he brought all the priests out of the city of Judah and defiled the high places where the priests had burned incense, from Geba to Beersheba. And he broke down the high places of the gates that were the entrance of the city of Joshua, to the governor of the city. And he defiled the Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, where that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Moloch. And he removed the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun at the entrance to the house of the Lord. And he burned the chariots of the sun with fire, and the altars of the roof of the upper chamber of Ahaz, which the kings of Judah had made, and the altars which Manasseh had made in the two courts of the house of the Lord, he pulled down and broke in pieces, and cast the dust of them into the brook Kidron. And the king defiled the high places that were east of Jerusalem, to the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon, the king of kings of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And he broke in pieces the pillars and cut down the Asherim. This is among God's people. Some of them were clearly worshipping correctly. So, Ellen White was weeping over her manuscript, but yet there's no limit to how far people can degenerate even in the name of the Lord. And then as now, we need a revival. I'm sure of it. And then as now, and I've been saying it for a number of years, and it's imminent now, this country is about to turn on every principle that founded it. And if you doubt that, go back and look at a few clips of things that happened in the last 6 months and listen to some of what the politicians were saying. They don't care what the Constitution says. They want their view to be in power. They don't care about the separation of church and state. Just last week, I heard I'm sure it was a Republican legislator in Washington, in a hearing where she was being challenged on their restriction of voting policies. They're cutting the hours on Sunday in certain areas. And one of the interlocutors said, Surely you know that black churches have a get out the vote effort on Sundays where they have buses and bus people to the voting stations. And she says they shouldn't be voting. This is the day of the Lord. This is the day that we need to protect by law. It was the same talk as back in 1888. I could give you much evidence. There are many legislators who believe this is their moment to use the power of the state to re-sanctify a corrupt people. Because you don't have to be a religionist particularly to know our society is in free fall. I tried to write about it in Liberty once. You know, the whole discussion about gay rights and gay marriage has short-circuited what should be the deepest discussion in the civil society. This is changing everything. It will change inheritance laws. It will change health administration. It will change disease patterns, obviously. Already adoption issues there, and social security, you name it. The entire fabric of society is threatened, not least of all the birth rate. And many thinkers are already troubled that Western countries are in population decline. Russia, seriously. And the US is playing out, which most of you don't remember, and I only know it from reading the books, but the eugenics controversy is with us again because there's a swapping of populations. Like Europe will be non-European within 20 years. That will not go without something akin to the French Revolution. A few years ago in Liberty, I reprinted, and my friend Clifford Goldstein and I would talk a lot, and he would mock me and say, I know, that's a lazy thing to reprint, which it is on a certain level. But with Liberty, I wanted to pull things from select moments in our church history to emphasize a point or to show that an issue's come up again. And in the Protestant magazine, which I admit I didn't even know existed until a few years ago. Protestant magazine for some years was printed alongside Liberty magazine. It was a very definitive Protestant take on our theology. In that, they printed an article about Rome's aims on America. And here's just two of the quotes mostly it was just quotes from current events or current issues. And in the Roman Catholic missionary magazine in 1910, they wrote this. They said, it seems to me that the main support of Protestantism comes from the United States and England, which I believe was true, is still true. And if you think about it, there's very little discussion, but that is the subtext on why Brexit took place. It says, if we put an end to this effort in England and the United States by making nations predominantly Catholic, we will have removed the chief obstacle to the conversion of the whole world to the true faith. A vigorous effort in the United States at this time will reduce the opposition to an insignificant condition. In the course of another century, the Protestant sects will be the study for the historian and the antiquarian, along with Arianism. Interesting. I mean, we're a little beyond that century. And another quote was from the New World in Chicago, October 21, 1905. It says, there has never been a period in American history when the church's opportunity, Catholic Church, has been so close to her. To a great extent, the ancient antagonisms have died. Protestantism is disintegrating before our eyes. The moment is ripe to build a Catholic America, broader and stronger and nobler and truer than any empire the world has yet seen, and strong men are now laying the foundations. I don't think we should hate Catholics by any means. Some of the contacts I've had with Catholics have been wonderful. There's admirable human beings in that persuasion, but what they stand for, what they're carrying forward is as Ellen White says, there's no question, she says, it's what it always has been, the apostasy of the end times. A few years ago, I was at a meeting for Catholics on religious liberty at Catholic University. And I went with a couple of Adventist laymen, and they said, where will we sit? And I said, we sit right in front of the lectern. There was a round table there. And the first speaker was Cardinal Dolan, then head of the Catholic bishops. And I thought he was going to be the next pope, but turned not to be so. But he carried forth very nicely on religious liberty. And while he's talking, I saw him do something that happens to me a lot. If you know what you're talking about, you can sort of talk, but you can be thinking about something else. And it's dangerous because when you've finished your sentence or two, if you've not got something else teed up, you're sort of speechless. And that happened to him. He finished what he was saying and then just stood there. And I thought, whoa, what's going to happen? And he looked out on this Catholic audience. There were a couple of Lutherans there and obviously three Adventists, but it was advertised for Catholics. And he said, you know, Roman Catholics would once not have spoken this way about religious liberty. He said, we once held that error has no rights. And then he sat down. He came off the stage and flopped down next to me, all happy, got it off his chest. And I spoke to him quickly and showed Liberty Magazine and invited him to come for a protocol dinner, which he accepted. But he said, you won't have the right thing for me to drink, will you? So, you know, in other words, I know you never happened because it scared some people, which I don't know if any of you are involved in the kickbacks on seeing our religious liberty leaders all but French kissing the Pope. You know, that's horrible. But there's no disgrace in bringing them for us to tell them what we believe. There's more danger going onto their enchanted ground. But anyhow, after that, they broke for drinks, literally. And then when they came back together, they had a program. And up front there was a historian, Catholic Charities person, and a theologian. And they had set topics. And before they could begin, the audience started just everywhere. What was the Cardinal talking about? What was he talking about? And they took the entire session to explain to Catholics that this indeed was their default position, but it was put aside for the time because of Vatican II. And so I would tell Adventists, when Vatican II is sort of dismissed by Catholics, which is already happening, watch out, because that is their view. And the last three popes have been dismissive of Vatican II. They've resented it and tried to turn it back. What I wrote at the time when we reprinted this article in Liberty, I'd like to share with you, because this is our chance to say something on a contemporary way. I said, it might be argued that much has changed since the article was written, and I would readily concur. Just one presidential election cycle ago, I think about 3 now, Senator Santorum, a dedicated Roman Catholic and a man of considerable personal integrity, been very supportive with us of legislative issues, startled many and was reported in the media widely by saying that Protestantism is absent in America today. Happily, most of the bigotry and violence against Roman Catholics that sometimes appeared in a once aggressively Protestant society has ceased. Religious freedom is extended to all, as the Constitution requires. When this article was written, the Roman Catholic Church was relatively weak, even though it had millions of adherents. Its original source of power, the Roman Empire, had long since vanished, and the strange European reincarnation of that power, the Holy Roman Empire, which also favoured the papacy, was weakened by the Protestant Reformation, before being destroyed by the secular forces of Napoleon Bonaparte, who took the Pope captive and removed his land possessions. By the way, have any of you ever read the Lateran Treaty, whereby Mussolini gave back power to and property to the Vatican? It's interesting. And among other things, it says there that the cardinals are to be granted the prerogatives of princes of the blood. That's the term it uses, princes of the blood. Certain things have occurred since the writing of this editorial. In 1939, the Lateran Treaty with fascist dictator Benito Mussolini restored sovereignty to the Holy See and gave it a status as a separate state by virtue of its 110 acres, smaller than this property. It may be the smallest state in the world, but its diplomatic network is unrivaled. Today, thanks to President Reagan, the US has full diplomatic ambassadorial relations with the Vatican. Today, the Vatican is an international power broker in a manner somewhat incongruous with its spiritual role. The Second Vatican Council of 1962-5 brought a sea change to the Catholic Church as it attempted to deal with a myriad of modern challenges, both within and without the Church. In particular, the document Dignitatis Humanae countered the historic actions and dogma of the Church by affirming the right of all to believe according to conscience and acknowledging a right to change religious affiliation. This was followed in 1999 by the papal document Memory and Reconciliation, which attempted to disavow the Church actions of other times, things like the persecution of the Jews, the Crusades and the Inquisition. As a result, the Roman Catholic Church is emerging as a modern-day champion of religious liberty. But history cannot be so easily disregarded as the world wonders at the newfound prestige of an old entity. The present Pope spoke before the US Congress as a moral savior. We should respect his opinion and the rights of his many fellow Roman Catholics in that body and in the nation as a whole. We should also remember history, past stated aims and present equivocations like the model of subsidiarity that might turn the elevated status of spiritual life into the overlordship of a religio-political power. You probably don't even know what I'm talking about, but I'm being symbolic there. They hold this view of subsidiarity. The church and state should be separate, which the Protestants don't hold anymore. But they say it should be separate according to the Catholics. But the state is subsidiary to the church. So that's as bad as the old medieval model. It just means that the pecking order is established and we'll wait for the moment to come and exercise our prerogative. America was once a Protestant society for good, doctrinal and historic reasons. Why the change? And America was once a stubbornly secular power for many of the same reasons. I don't know what I should or shouldn't say, but it's not that I fear for my reputation or my job, but there's proprietary interest. But I should tell you that I've been personally shaken by the lack of church response to some recent developments. And when the Pope spoke before Congress, to me that was a massive moment, both for the country as a whole and from the point of faith. Never before has a religious leader spoken to the Joint Congress. Never. Only a few leaders. There was Lafayette, Winston Churchill, I think 3 times, Netanyahu. Probably shouldn't have happened because it was overtly political. But, a few leaders. A little before the Pope came, there were a number of people wanted the Dalai Lama to speak in. It wouldn't have offended me greatly because he's a sort of a doting, or as the North Koreans said, a dotard that says nice things. But it would have been dangerous from a church-state point of view. But that was decided as too confrontational. But because the Speaker and the Majority Leader were both Roman Catholics, it went ahead. And to this day, I cannot understand why our church in its most official ways didn't rise up and proclaim that Babylon has fallen and that this country is on the verge of compromising its most precious principles. Didn't happen. I was there that day with the 3 ABN people, although I wasn't with them, but we both got in together. I listened incredulously to the speech, and most people never really deconstructed it. But I love history. And there was an attempt to place an Eastern mystical Catholic priest and a socialist Catholic nun into the pantheon of American heroes. And then the Pope kicked off with Martin Luther King, which is fine, non-confrontational. But his first example was Abraham Lincoln, as he looked to a bust or a picture in the chamber. I know my history. Obviously, it's not known anymore in America. I cast about through all the magazines and news reports. Nobody said, what bad taste to do that. Do you remember how Abraham Lincoln was killed? I mean, my kids, when they went through primary and high school, it just says, frustrated actor, Booth, offended by the despot, shot him, and, he was captured and killed. And some Adventists might know Chick publications and all that fantastical stuff, which may or may not be true, but go to history. You can go and see a Matthew Brady photograph of the first hanging of a woman in this country, where 6 of the 11 conspirators were hung days after the event. It was well known. There were 11 Roman Catholics, including Jesuit priests, in a conspiracy to destroy the government, not just to kill Abraham Lincoln. That same night, another conspirator stabbed and left for dead the Secretary of State. He survived. Another was tasked to kill the Vice President. He missed his appointment. Another was to kill General Grant. He missed his appointment. If they'd all succeeded, it would have been a decapitated government. The only Southern agent of the group was Mary Surratt, the innkeeper's wife, her brother was a Southern agent. He was out of town during the attempt, which again tells me it wasn't really a Southern plot. And so he immediately headed off for Canada, where he was sheltered by Jesuit priests, and made his way to Rome and joined the Pope's bodyguard. You couldn't make this stuff up if you tried. And here, this Pope was not personally culpable, but you would think there'd be some embarrassment. And my view is it was to test, see if they notice, and not a reaction. Not a reaction. I believe the lay of the land is not just in the Bible, not just in the advice to Ellen White for our day. I believe Rome itself has put out their battle plan from here to the close of probation. The document Laudato Si is most significant. How many of you have read it? Good. It's about 120 pages long. It's longer than most. I've been reading most of the important ones. Now I'll just share you a couple of paragraphs. He gives it a very portentous setting. He says this is not a document for Catholics, not for Christians, it's for the whole world. And it starts by saying that the earth is like our mother or our sister. Of course, they have to throw in the female goddess imagery, but it's like Mother Earth, or our young sister is dying. The earth is dying, and we are going to die if she passes away. So he says this is a matter of humanity's survival to do something about it. And then fairly early on, he says this. Paragraphs, well, it's 68, but it's fairly early on. He says, this responsibility for God's earth means that human beings endowed with intelligence must respect the laws of nature. And as I read this, I think, first angel's message, honor the Creator God. We should have been the first people to talk about protecting the world from degradation and collapse. It says God is coming to destroy those that destroy the earth. It says we must respect the laws of nature and the delicate equilibria existing between the creatures of the world. For he commanded, quoting Psalms 148, and they were created, and he established them forever and ever. He fixed their bounds, and he set a law which cannot pass away. The laws found in the Bible dwell on relationships, not only among individuals, but also with other living beings. And then I'll read it. You shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen down by the way and withhold your help. If you chance to come upon a bird's nest in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting upon them, you shall not take the mother with the young. Along these same lines, rest on the seventh day is meant not only for human beings, but also so that your ox and your donkey may have rest. Clearly, the Bible has no place for a tyrannical anthropocentrism, unconcern for other creatures. And he says we see this in the story of Noah, when God threatens to do away with humanity because of its constant failure to fulfill the requirements of justice and peace. These ancient stories, full of symbolism, bear witness to a conviction which we today share, that everything is interconnected. Of course, that's another aspect they're pushing, is the common good. And that genuine care for our own lives and our relationships with nature is inseparable from fraternity, justice, and faithfulness to others. Although the wickedness of man was great in the earth, Genesis 6:5, and the Lord was sorry that he'd made man, nevertheless, through Noah, who remained innocent and just, God decided to open a path of salvation. In this way, he gave humanity the chance of a new beginning. All it takes is one good person to restore hope. The biblical tradition clearly shows that this renewal entails recovering and respecting the rhythms inscribed in nature by the hand of the Creator. We see this, for example, in the law of the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God rested from all his work. He commanded Israel to set aside each seventh day as a day of rest, a Sabbath. And then it says on Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationship to God. It says the law of weekly rest forbade work on the seventh day, so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your maidservant and the stranger may be refreshed. Rest opens our eyes to the larger picture. And as I read a lot of this, I hear Bakioki resonating. I know they've subverted what he wrote. It says, rest opens our eyes to the larger picture and gives us renewed sensitivity to the rights of others. And so the day of rest centered on the Eucharist sheds its light on the whole week and motivates us to a greater concern. The entire document near the end figuratively ends by saying, as we journey toward that eternal Sabbath. What are you going to say when Sabbath is forced on you on that way? Proof texting will not do it. And I believe it's what Ellen White says. The argument, she says, is not so much carried forward by, your argument is carried forward by the sense of conviction you have and the faith in the Lord. You have to be convinced of the importance of being faithful to the Lord. We're past the point where you can debate with Catholics about which Bible texts support the Sabbath. Dies Domini, again, Bakioki front to center. They don't challenge that. It was encapsulated in a little statement in Dies Domini. It said, while the early Christians had no direct commands from their Lord to change the day, they felt they had the authority. And I do believe when it comes to the end of time, it's a question of authority. Do you follow Jesus? Do you follow his word? Or do you follow what men and their rules say? Even if it's the man of sin sitting in the throne, or the president invoking all of the cherished promised nation and manifest destiny and all you have it, or the good of the people and so on. Doesn't matter. We need to set our faces like flint to be faithful no matter what happens. And that's back to A.T. Jones. That will only happen when you just cut adrift from all these fanciful ideas about this country or another country. In some ways people were blessed to be in communist the Union of Socialist Republics, because it was a pretty easy for most people thing to discern that this was not anything close to God's principle. But here many people still think God's somehow going to redeem this nation, on a certain level, like Nineveh, and I've tried to write on it. If at this late point there was a turning toward God, I believe the evil day would be put off. But like Ellen White, I believe that it's sort of clear that the die is cast and we're moving toward that final confrontation that will result in an absolute test of conscience. In great controversy, and you know this, these are old sores almost of Adventism. Ellen White says, in accidents and calamities by sea and by land, in great conflagrations. I think of the fires over west at the moment. The buildings falling. Even in Australia, I saw that they're evacuating people from high rises. Last time I was down there, I stayed on the 45th floor of about an 80-story building on the beach, on sand. I'm not so sure now that one day some of those will just come on down like the 9/11 collapse. She says, in fierce tornadoes and terrific hailstorms and tempests, floods, cyclones, tidal waves and earthquakes, in every place and in 1,000 forms, Satan is exercising his power. He sweeps away the ripening harvest, and famine and distress follow. He imparts to the air a deadly taint. COVID meets that. And thousands perish by the pestilence. These visitations are to become more and more frequent and disastrous. Destruction will be upon both man and beast. The earth mourneth and fadeth away. The haughty people do languish. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the law, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. And as you know, it goes on saying that Satan will say that we've provoked God's displeasure. Already we've had the Jerry Falwells, and because he's gone, and a few others saying, 9/11 was caused by, the rights to gays and so on. But when in this current string of calamities will it become serious? I think we're on the verge of it. When these right-wing, mostly politicians who don't seem to respect the Constitution or anything, wanting to force us all into, their abominable form of worship. That most of the televangelists are right up there with Kardashian and other role models. It's horrible where faith has come, but there's a readiness to apply it to law. For years, I've been sharing a testimony of Ellen White's that is sort of echoed in many published books, but the original story, or the one that I quote, is not published. It's in manuscript releases, which is sort of published but not printed. It's just facsimile. And on 9/11, when I remember was my friend Clifford Goldstein come bounding into my office in the morning. He says, "Turn on the TV." And I had a TV in my office. He says, "There's a plane just hit one of the Twin Towers." And so I switched it on, and while we were watching, we saw the second plane hit. And I remember, like many people, we were saying, are they going to fall? And I said, I don't think so. I remember seeing newsreels, as they used to call them, of a 4-engine bomber during World War II hit the Empire State. It made a bit of a mess, but the building didn't seem in any danger. So I was surprised when it came down. And so immediately I told him, I said, I remember reading in Ellen White where she speaks about something that seems to fit this to a T. And it stuck in my mind because I found a misprint, which is sort of like the Sinner's Bible. There was a Bible once printed that made it took out a negative, I think, and it sort of encouraged you towards sin. So we don't think of misprints, but I was certain it was because it was grammatically incomplete. And so Cliff says, "You need to go to the White Estate, go to the White Estate." So I went to them, and their immediate reaction, they came back, "No, that's the way it's printed." And I said, "But it can't be. It's grammatically improper." So they went away and checked on the original writings of Ellen White, a handwritten version. And I remember, now I'm bad on names. Anyhow, the associate came back to me and he said, "You're right. It was printed as expression, and what she actually wrote was explosion." And this is what, do I have it? If I have it, I'll read it to you. If not, I'll do it from memory. No, I don't have it here. What Ellen White says, she said she was in a room, not in her home, but she didn't know where. And this is why people didn't seem to notice it, because she spoke other places about being in New York and seeing buildings that couldn't be put out. And she said she awoke, and out of her window, she saw explosion after explosion. She heard explosion after explosion, not expression after expression. So we know there were two buildings, explosions. And then she saw flames jetting out like arrows. That's exactly. And then she says within a few minutes, the buildings were falling and the entire block of buildings fell. And on 9/11, 3 buildings fell, the entire block. And by the way, I'm not saying this has to be the fulfillment, but it really resonated with me. And then she said what came to her mind particularly was the mournful cries of the people as the buildings collapsed. And that's what sticks with me. I've got some videos of 9/11. The cry of despair by the crowd as the towers of complacency fell. And she said from her raised position, she cried out and she said, "Lord, where am I and where is my family?" And she said it was a voice that answered, and it says, "Do not be afraid, it will not come near you." And to me, that's really the best promise we can take in these days. If we're on about God's business, and I wish with COVID our church leaders, felt free to travel. I've gotten into trouble for traveling. That's forbidden. If we're about the Lord's business, there's a higher existence that vindicates us anyway, but there's a certain protection promise. Do not be afraid. It will not come near you. And then on another level, think about what's happened. This is, it's a bit like Samson pulling down the building of the Philistines. Their world ended, they thought, with that. But surely even the Philistine Empire was more than one building. And I've told audiences, what about London? Day after day for weeks. I think it was several months. The entire German Air Force bombed them. They were never at risk of collapsing. but one symbol, a World Trade Center comes down, and we're quaking in our boots. This is the time, as it says, men's hearts failing them for fear of what is coming on the earth. And this was just the beginning of troubles. You know, I can tell you just one thing that if you're inclined, you'll be panicky. In 2005, I went along as a guest of an Adventist lawyer who's incredibly politically connected. He was running the campaign for one of the prime ministerial guys in Canada. He's got dual citizenship. So he took me along as his guest to board meetings of a right-wing planning group in Colorado Springs. I don't know to this day how they let me in. There were 3 Reagan cabinet members, there were 2 billionaires, and a few other movers and shakers there, only about 10 or 15 of them. It was an incredible round of meetings, but on the Sunday morning, we had a breakfast reception, just 3 tables in a little room in the hotel. There were thousands of other people for the meetings. At one stage, I sat next to Pat Boone and got his notes from his rough, hard-write speech. That was interesting. But for our little talk, as we ate breakfast, and I was at the middle table, the General Eberhard, he's retired, but he was in charge of Northern Command for all of the military in the US looking toward Canada and Mexico. Everything. Coast Guard, Army, Navy, Air Force, you name it. The lot. Nice guy, but it just curled my hair to listen to him because he told us about their plans for martial law. So when the other day I hear Flynn, just going off loosely talking about martial law and encouraging the ex-president to do it, I don't know where this comes from. And what he described was in this time of trouble, when they believe it's going, clearly we're 15 years past it, they believe it's coming. They're going to put a cordon around most of the big cities that have beltways and stuff, and there'll be nobody in and nobody out. You want to be inside such a city? Be a cesspool. And as he was talking, I said to this guy, I said, what are they going to do with the detainees? They're going to give them to the police? I know the answer. Of course not. No military has legal niceties. When they take you, they kill you or put you in a stockade and you go before a military tribunal. And he must have heard me because you're like 5 foot in front of him. And he stopped and he says, some people might have problems with what we're planning because of posse comitatus laws. He says, we see no problem because of changes to the law. I don't know what changes there are. By law, the military is not to move against the citizenry. We're in a new model of behaviour. Extraordinary things are about to happen. And neither you nor I know the next move, but we do know the overall plan. We know that conscience will be so severely threatened that false religion will demand that you and I worship. And it's not enough just to know the truth. I really don't think so. Because, what would you do if you were not very spiritually minded and here your country's collapsing around you? You would think it a fine thing to support that. As I am positive, I will give my prophecy. Before the world is over, you will see somewhere in our own publications some weaselly statement that given that the times we're in and recognizing the Sabbath is the day, that still we encourage people not to oppose the authorities and, we know better, but go along with it. I'm positive. And we just have to decide that we are on a way to heaven. And the only way to do that is if we're already heavenly minded. I've come to that conclusion. Righteousness by faith, yes, is vital, but it's not theory. It has to be organic. It has to be people that will die before they will give in. And not just because they're Adventists, in fact, hardly because they're Adventists. Much of Adventism, is in the history books. Much of Adventism today, you can be embarrassed by it. No, it's because we serve Jesus Christ. The author and the finisher of our faith. And yes, we haven't seen him. I've read articles with mock it, and middle-aged women sort of go into swoons over it because there's this made-up lover and all that. The worldly people can't understand it. But if we understand that we owe our life and our very being to a God who personified through Jesus Christ, why shouldn't we have an emotional attachment to that situation? Turn our life over to that new coming reality. That's what is at the root of religious liberty. I've tried to tell people that. Adventists think that magazines like Liberty and our efforts with the legislature, are keeping or getting religious liberty for it. It's all done. What does the Bible say? I've set before you an open door that no man can shut. And Paul says, this gospel of liberty, what is it? You are free from sin. That's done. But we have to exercise it, and that's the trick, Some people have lost their lives over that. The stakes are very high, very high. What time? We're quitting time now. I want to give you a quote, and it's a great quote from the wrong source. If you know U.S. history, one of the heroes of American secular history was actually the enemy of religious freedom, or at least separation of church and state, Patrick Henry. You know much about him? But he gave a great speech, and like many famous speeches in history, they may not have been given word for word as we get them, but the way it's written, it's inspiring. He says, well, you know the quote where he says, give me liberty or give me death, right? But very few people have read what goes before it. He got up in their convocation in the St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, I didn't even write the year, but it was before, they'd formulated a government properly. But it was in March 23, and he says, it is vain, sir, to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field, and Adventists should know that. It's getting to a head here, but plenty of countries, they're in the middle of it. Future troubles, they could laugh at that. It's happening now. You want to be in Myanmar? I've been there and seen what's going on. Even when I was there, the military encamped out front of our church because they don't trust Adventists. Why stand we here idle, he says. What is it that the gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it. And then he gives his classic statement. That's what we need to understand. This isn't theoretical, it's now. And in some ways, I've come to believe that the greatest stresses are in Western countries, because it comes out insidiously at you. We're not put to the stretch. And I don't wish personal troubles any more than anyone. But looking at the situation, I believe it's a stress that brings the church to where it should be, and as was said before, most people will go. The story of Gideon is not a one-off. That's generally how it is. Even of those who volunteer, they go by the way. They're drinking good water but a bad way. Ellen White in medical ministry, probably written somewhere else, but compilations I'm not really keen on them because they pull stuff out of context, or at least wrest them a little bit, and you lose the theme from a book. But she says, soon, strife among the nations will break out with an intensity that we do not now anticipate. And this is also the first quote in the book Last Day Events, which was put together in 1992 by the White Estate. They had to have been transfixed by Gulf War I. She says, the present is a time of overwhelming interest to all living. Rulers and statesmen, men who occupy positions of trust and authority, thinking men and women of all classes, have their attention fixed upon the events taking place about us. They are watching the strained, restless relations that exist among the nations. They observe the intensity that is taking possession of every earthly element, and they realize that something great and decisive is about to take place, that the world is on the verge of a stupendous crisis. God bless you as we enter into that crisis time.